We're going to look at Genesis 35. One, I was told by a couple of people that they did not, they did like a brief review before we get too far into it. And I'm going to try to keep these reviews as short as possible because I have a lot of material. We're talking largely about just one person for the last few weeks, and that's been Jacob, who was one of the twin sons that was born to Isaac and Rebekah, and at an early age, after he had gotten involved in getting the birthright of his brother Esau, by one means or another, found it necessary to flee from their home and flee it led all the way on up to Laban, his uncle, who was Rebekah, his mother's brother. And when he was with Laban, his uncle, way up in Haran, way up in the upper part of Mesopotamia, he married two of Laban's daughters, Leah and Rachel, and took on two concubines and managed to have a matter of 11 sons and one daughter and make himself very wealthy in a period of about 20 years. I won't go through all the details of that other than to mention that from the dates of the birth of some of these people, we can sort of figure out when some of these other things happened, because the time came after 20 years that Jacob felt that it was necessary to go back down to Palestine. There he would have to meet his brother, who had sworn to kill him because of the fact that he had stolen his birthright. He had no idea what to get, what was going to happen, and anticipated a lot of problems, but it turned out that when he got together with Esau, they found that they had a lot in common in being brothers, and they parted as friends, but they did part. They went to their own separate ways. Esau went back to Edom, where he had come from, and Jacob went on to a place called Succoth, and then from Succoth, which is on this side of the Jordan River, this is the Jordan River, here's Succoth. He went and bought some land near Shechem. Shechem was a very principal city in Ephraim at that time. He bought land and he settled down there. Now, how long was he there? Well, we can figure that at the time that he went there, Dinah, the daughter that he had, and Joseph, his youngest son, were about 2 or 3 years old. And the first story that we get concerning what happened on the other side of the Jordan River was when Dinah was old enough to be married. As a matter of fact, she was old enough so that she attracted the attention of one of the princes there, and here's all the stuff of how they got the dates. Dinah was, that she was kidnapped and raped. That caused a lot of problems. Because what happened after raping the girl, he fell in love with her and wanted to marry her. And so arrangements were made between Jacob, who was Dinah's father, and Hamor, who was the king of Shechem at that time, that this marriage could be arranged, but there were going to be certain stipulations. Well, one of the stipulations was this, that the men of Shechem had to be the same as the men of Jacob's family. That meant that they all had to be circumcised. They agreed to this, and they underwent this rather general circumcision. We won't go into the details of this other than the fact that on the third day, when they were sore, two of the sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, took their swords and came upon the city unawares and killed all the males. They slew Hamor and his son Shechem with a sword and took Dinah out of Shechem's house and went away. I have some pictures of them coming in. There's Dinah being taken away. I've got another better picture of Dinah being escorted away. Why that man doesn't have his trousers on, I do not know. A wholesale slaughter. Then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, "You have brought trouble on me, making me odious to the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites and the Perizzites, and my numbers are few. And if they gather themselves against me and attack me, I shall be destroyed, both I and my household." But they said, should he treat our sister as a harlot? And guess what? That chapter stops right at that point. No more. And all of a sudden we jump into chapter 35. Genesis 35. I did have a subtitle here, and I took the subtitle out yesterday because I thought it really wasn't quite appropriate. The subtitle was a potpourri. It looked like a whole big mixture of different stories. But as I was going through this the last couple of days, I realized there was a chronological order to the way in which these stories were presented, and they could very well have occurred in the order that we see them here. But what we find in Genesis 35, the fact they leave Shechem, they go to Bethel, Benjamin is born, Rachel dies at the same time, Isaac dies, and there's a problem with Reuben. All these things happened at one time. Now, a couple of weeks ago, when I was talking to you folks, I thought I could just brush over this rather quickly and get right into the chapter 37. Chapter 36 we're not going to do anything with. I think I mentioned to you a couple of weeks ago, it was a listing of all of the descendants of Esau who were living in Edom. And I cannot pronounce any of the names. But before we went to chapter 37, I thought maybe I'd just take another quick look at Genesis 35. Well, now I hope I can get through with one lesson. God said to Jacob, arise, go up to Bethel and dwell there, and I'll make there an altar to God who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau. So Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, put away your foreign gods that are among you, and purify yourselves and change your garments. Then let us arise and go up to Bethel, that I may make there an altar to the God who answered me the day of my distress and has been with me ever since I have gone. So they gave Jacob all their foreign gods they had, and the rings that were in their ears, and Jacob hid them under an oak which was near Shechem. And I think I did show you the picture of that burying of all these treasures under the oak. Well, I went into that a little bit further, and I realized that this was a little bit different from what I had expected. Actually, what they were talking about was teraphim. Teraphim are idols, but they're different from some of the other idols. I think I have a rather long, well, here is the definition. It's an idol or an image reference to the ancient Hebrews and kindred people, apparently their household gods. Now, you've heard that expression, household gods, before, and now it is associated with the name teraphim. Here is a rather long. I got it. Teraphim is a Hebrew word for the Bible found only in the plural in an uncertain etymology. The word teraphim is explained in the classical rabbinical literature as meaning disgraceful things. And in many English translations, it is translated as idols or household gods, though the exact meaning is more specific than this, but unknown precisely. But it seems to be something that's associated very much with the Hebrews. And it's very possible that Jacob's family would have had some teraphim. These are typical teraphim. Now, if you look at them, they're not too different from the Asherah that we may have looked at in the past concerning the Canaanite idols. They look very much like fertility goddesses. These are the sort of teraphim that we read about in Genesis 31. And that is when Jacob was leaving Laban up in Haran, Rachel had stolen the household gods. Remember that story? Now, Rachel had taken the household gods and put them in a camel saddle and sat upon them. Laban felt all about the tent, but did not find them. He had searched through that whole camp looking for those idols. And she said to her father, let not my Lord be angry that I cannot rise before you, for the way of women is upon me. So he searched but did not find the idols. He was able to get. Here is Laban looking for those idols. However, another thing that was found that was quite interesting is that among the idols that were included with the teraphim were plastered skulls. Now, of all things, plastered skulls. Here's a picture of Kathleen Kenyon with teraphim skulls. She is the one that made this discovery of these skulls in one of her expeditions into the city of Jericho. I always like this picture because I remember something that she had written about the time that she was going to go into Jericho. Jericho had been examined by archaeologists about 40 or 50 years before that. And she said she was going back to examine the city of Jericho without any biblical baggage and not be hindered in any way of finding out what the truth was by saying, I've got to make this correspond to the Bible. And she did. And she found some things that were fascinating about Jericho. When you hear the word Jericho, what's one of the first things you think about? The walls come tumbling down. They did. About 300 years before Joshua got on the scene. There's a lot of good archaeological evidence that they may have come down as early as about 1500 BC in an earthquake or something like that. But it was a part of the legends of that time that the Jericho walls came down. Why not let Joshua do it? Later on, we're going to get to the book of Joshua. We're going to find out there's one thing that you can rely on in the book of Joshua, that none of it is historical. Absolutely none of it. There's a little hints of it once in a while. But she found these skulls. Now, what's the purpose of that? Remember the story of Michal saving David? Michal was the newlywed wife of David. Saul was out to kill David. Michal finds out about it, and she allows David to escape through the window. You all remember this picture. What you might forget is what happened right after that. So Michal let David down through the window, and he fled away and escaped. Michal took an image and laid it out on the bed and put a pillow of goat's hair on its head and covered it with clothes. Then when Saul sent messengers to take David, she said, he is sick. Then Saul took the messengers to see David. Saying, bring him up to me, that I may kill him. And when the messengers came in, behold, the image was in the bed with a pillow of goat's hair at its head. This is the only picture I could find. That is not David back there. That is one of these idols. That's one of these sculpted skulls. There's Rachel, and David was able to get away. Now that's the only other place I could find anything about these sculpted skulls. But it is kind of interesting that the word teraphim shows up 9 different times in the Old Testament. And it doesn't say anything about idols or anything, but just refers to teraphim, so it very likely is referring largely to those things that were a part of the Hebrew background of these people. Let's go back to those first 4 verses that we had in chapter 35. I did not include the 5th verse of chapter 1, chapter 35. Remember that at the end of chapter 34, Jacob expressed some concern about the fact that people were going to be very unhappy with him because of what Simeon and Eli had done. In verse 5 it says, then they journeyed, a terror from God fell upon the cities that were around them and about them, so that they did not pursue some of Jacob. None of them gave Jacob any trouble. He and his entourage were able to leave. And Jacob came to Luz, now that's another name for Bethel, which is in the land of Canaan, and he and all the people were with him. And there he built an altar and called the place Bethel, because their God had revealed himself to him when he fled from his brother. And Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died, and she was buried under the oak below Ethel, so the name of it was called Abith-Becca. This was one of the more interesting verses because I could find absolutely nothing more about this other than that when Rebekah left to go to get married to Isaac, she took her nurse with her. Apparently this nurse had been with Jacob and his family that whole time. But this is rather significant. He's going back to where? He's going back to Bethel. Now let's take a look at this map. He comes from way up here, from here. This is where he meets his brother Esau, and they become friends. This is where he has that interesting situation of wrestling with the man. The man then gave him a blessing. The man said, "You have wrestled with God." Then he crosses the Jordan River and buys the land. He actually stops at Succoth for a while. And gets to Shechem. There he stays for maybe 15, 20 years. We don't know how long. But we do know that it is after the situation with Dinah. Dinah must have been at least 18, 19 years old at that time. So it must have been about another 15 years before they made this trip down from Shechem toward Hebron. And we're going to stop at Bethel, the place that he had been before when he was fleeing. Okay, when he was there before, he was just young. He was probably 25 years old at that time. That's where he had the dream of the angels ascending and descending the ladder. And at the top of the ladder was the Lord himself. And what we are told is that, now do I go to N?
N for next.
That he realized this was a holy place, and therefore he set up a pillar and called the place Bethel. Does anybody remember what Bethel means? House of God. El means God, Beth means house, and El means God. Here is the return to Bethel, and you see the picture is a little bit different in that what we find people along with Jacob this time. All right. Again, we find that Jacob is blessed by God. Here is the blessing. God appeared to Jacob again when he came from Padan Aram. This is about the time that it's coming back from the north. Why that mentions this way, I'll point that out a little bit later. And God said to him, "Your name is Jacob, no longer shall your name be called Jacob, but Israel is your name." And so his name is called Israel. Now, how many recall that that's almost exactly the same thing that was said when he was wrestling with the man before they crossed the river Jordan? Almost the same thing. It's the same story, but it's told a little bit differently this time. Okay, and God came up in a place where he had spoken to him. And Jacob set up a pillar. This time he sets up a pillar, but you'll notice he's older. And this is Jacob many years later. We'll get to what the age might actually be a little bit later on. Getting back to this map, we're going to go from Shechem to Bethel, and now he's headed down toward what? Bethlehem and Hebron. Eventually, he will get all the way down to Beersheba. The next thing that we read about is that Rachel dies. When they arrived at Bethel, when they journeyed from Bethel, then they were still some distance from Ephrath. Ephrath is another name for Bethlehem. Rachel traveled, and she had hard labor. And when she was in hard labor, the midwife said to her, "Fear not, for now you will have another son." And as her soul was departing, she died. And she called the name Benoni, but his father named him Benjamin. So what we find is right after that time in Bethel, they're on their way to Bethlehem. Rachel goes into labor, and she dies during childbirth, and the son is born. The son is what? Benjamin. Now, we're going to go back in chapter 37, all the way back to when Joseph was 17 years old, about the same age that Dinah was when all these things took place. And that's when Joseph was kidnapped. We find out that Benjamin was born long after Joseph was kidnapped. So Benjamin, when he is a slave in Egypt, does not even know about the fact of a brother that he has. That becomes rather pertinent in the story that comes later. Rachel dies. Here's a couple pictures of them. So Rachel died and she was buried, and on the way to Ephraim, that is Bethlehem. And Jacob set up a pillar upon her grave. It is the pillar of Rachel's tomb, which is there to this day. Now, I did have that pillar. This is the tomb. This is an old picture of the tomb. This is a modern picture of the tomb. There is the pillar. Now I'll go back. Let's go back to this tomb. This tomb was probably built not too long after Rachel died. Now, let's remember what we know about Rachel in terms of her relationship with Jacob. She was his favorite wife. Leah was the first wife he was married to, the older sister of Rachel, but Rachel was his favorite wife, and she was treated as his favorite wife, even though Jacob had all these other children with both Leah and with these concubines. But when Rachel died, or soon after, they built this tomb. And that tomb, as I indicated, is still there today. As a matter of fact, it's sort of what you might call a religious symbol for an awful lot of the people. Now, eventually you're going to come across something that I think is interesting to think about, and that is that Jacob is going to die. Where is Jacob going to be buried? Well, obviously, he should be buried with his favorite wife. What we're going to find out is that when Jacob does die, there is in Egypt, mind you, there's a huge funeral train taking him all the way up to be buried, not with Rachel, but to be buried in the cave at Machpelah, and not buried with Rachel. I'll get into that. I'll get into that a little bit later. I did find out something kind of interesting, that this is one of the most visited spots in Palestine today because it's fairly easy to get to. And it's become a shrine of women, particularly women who have not borne children, because of the fact that Rachel had 2 children after many years of infertility, then she did have children. So it's a very highly revered area of Palestine. I wish I had this mouse working again. So that's what I had just mentioned to you. Jacob set up a pillar there, and then we get this part. Because when we read this rather carefully, we find out that in chapter 35, if things will come up correctly, okay, in chapter 35, we read about the pillar being set up, but in verse 22, what we read here is that while Israel dwelt in the land, Reuben went in and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard of it. Now, I think this next slide I have is kind of interesting because it shows what the it shows chapter 35. You see the different colors? The blue is written by the Elohist source. The black is the priestly source. The red is the only source that is said to be a part of the Yahweh source. And that's the part concerning Reuben. And that's all that we have. That's all we have. Other than when we get to chapter 49, the first couple of verses that we have in chapter 49, which is the time when Jacob calls all of his sons together and tells them what's going to happen. Jacob called all his sons and said, "Gather yourselves together that I may tell you what shall befall you in the days to come. Assemble and hear. Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, and the first fruits of my strength, preeminent in pride and preeminent in power. Unstable as water, you shall not have a preeminence, because you went up to your father's bed and you defiled it. You went into my couch." And that's all we know. Now, let me tell you what I have found out about this. It's rather interesting. There is something definite that we can say about what happened there, and I'll show you what that is if I can get this back. These are the explanations. One of the explanations is this: if you take a look at the age of the people at this time, you'd find out that if Jacob were about 25 when he fled to go up to Haran, and then spent 20 years in Haran when he got all the children and was with his uncle Abel, he'd be 45. If he comes back down to, and there's another 20 or so years, by the time we get to the travel down to Bethel, he'd be about 65 years old. Reuben, in the meantime, is going to be about 30 years old. Reuben sees that his father is old. He figures that 65 is old. And he is going to assert his rights as the head of the family. Now, you go back in the Old Testament, you find out there was sort of a tradition among rulers, and that is that when you took over the throne of some other king, one of the first things you did was take control of his harem. As a matter of fact, when we get to the story of David, we find out that David gets very direct advice from a guy named Ahithophel. If you want to rebel against your father David, what you got to do is take all of David's concubines and put them on the roof of the house, and then go up and let everybody know that you're spending time with his concubines. Then they will assume, okay, you are in charge. They think that maybe this is what Reuben had in mind. Hey, I'm 30 years old. Jacob is old. Why don't I take charge? That was one explanation. The other explanation is the one that we get here, and that is that Reuben was attempting to drive Jacob to Leah's tent after Rachel had died. Now that comes from a very interesting place. It comes from what is known as the Targum. Targum is an originally spoken translation of the Hebrew Bible that is not a professional translator who would give in common language of the listeners that were not Hebrew. In other words, I'll tell you what's in the Hebrew Bible in your language. This has become necessary near the end of the 1st century BCE, as the common language of Aramaic and Hebrew was little used in the Bible, was used for little more than schooling worship. The translator frequently expanded the translation with paraphrases, explanations, and examples, so it became kind of a sermon. And that's actually what has been suggested here, and that is that this second explanation is that Reuben was doing nothing more than trying to help his mother by making Jacob go to his mother's tent rather than to Bilhah's tent, which was the favorite, the servant of Rachel. The one I have in italics, I think, is the one that we can rely on. Nobody really knows. As a matter of fact, most people, most of the commentators say there's much more going on here than we know, than what we can get from the Bible. Something had happened with the tribe of Reuben that antagonized a lot of people. And suddenly Reuben is on the sort of the outs. Reuben was the firstborn. He was a son of Leah. He was a brother of Levi and of Simeon and of Judah. But when the 12 tribes separate, guess what? Reuben is with the 10 tribes to the north. Reuben is not with Judah. Benjamin's with Judah, but Reuben is not. And this makes some of the commentators feel rather strongly that there's something that must have happened that we just do not know about that made Reuben unsavory in the mouths of a lot of people. We're going to see this showing up also in the book of chapter 27. Now let's see if I can get a... This is what a Targum was. Okay, get some more potpourri. After that section, we get a part of Genesis 35 that you wonder, how did this end up here? What it is a list of all the children that, or all the sons that Jacob had with their mother. Leah's sons, and you'll notice the first 4 are Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Then Issachar and Zebulun were the sons that came later. Rachel had Joseph and Benjamin. These are the sons of Jacob. It's just put in that chapter 35. is sort of is a part of the priestly writing, and it's sort of an indication that the priests say, look, we want to keep track of everything here, and let's not lose anything. The priests are great for listing names. Chapter 36 that I don't talk about, guess who wrote that? The priestly writers. Chapter 35 was, then Jacob came to his father Isaac in Mamre. Oh yeah, Jacob does get together with Isaac. Now the days of Isaac were 180 years. And Isaac breathed his last, and he died, and was gathered to his people, old and full of days, and his sons Esau and Jacob were buried with him. Actually, he does get together with Esau, with Isaac again. And it's kind of interesting because of the fact it says that Isaac was 180 years old. But if you start putting all these ages together, guess what? The arithmetic doesn't work. The arithmetic doesn't work at all. There's about a 60-year period that it seems to be missing. This was one of the indications that I think is rather significant in terms of what we're going to be getting into in just a few moments. And that is that what we find in the book of Genesis and also in Exodus and in Numbers, that there's more than one source that the person that is putting it together is using. And is using different stories. But he wants to use as much as he can of each story because he doesn't want to hurt anybody's feelings. But what we are told here that is rather significant is that when he was together, Jacob and Esau get together again, because when Isaac died, Esau comes up and Jacob and Esau bury Isaac. And where do they bury Isaac? In the cave at Machpelah, not with Rachel. He goes to the cave of Machpelah. Before I talk about that, I want to talk about this documentary hypothesis, and I just hinted to it. There are different sources, different stories that are being used to put that book of Genesis together. Looking at this is where the only real accurate word here is brief, a very brief introduction. Let's take a look at some things that are important. Up until about the 15 or 1600s, there was an inerrant respect for the Old Testament. Do you know what that means? That means you read the Old Testament and it is without any error or mistake. And you read it as such, and what you read must be so. And you do not question it. In the 1600s already, there were people that were questioning it. One of these was a Dutchman by the name of Spinoza. Most of you recognize Spinoza as being Jewish, but he actually was a second generation Dutch of Portuguese descent. But he was a very learned man. And he was one that questioned the idea that if Moses wrote all these things that we have in the Torah, in the 5 books, which we call the books of Moses, how did he know about his death and where he was buried? Somebody else must have written that. What happened to Spinoza is that he got excommunicated from the Jewish church, if you can get excommunicated. He was disowned by the Christians, and he was sought out by people from all over Europe as being one of the most learned men in Europe at that time, and died at the age of 44, and yet left an imprint that was, it's lasted to this day. One of the reasons being that he was a very important person in terms of the period of enlightenment when people started to say, let's look at this rather carefully. And he was partly responsible for the fact there were a number of other people that were looking at the Old Testament rather carefully, particularly the book of Genesis, and they said, it's rather obvious that we've got different stories here. Maybe they came from different sources. And it was the documentary hypothesis that was postulated by this man, Wellhausen. It was postulated on the basis of a lot of the work of other people, but he gets a lot of the credit. That The documentary okay. The documentary hypothesis posited that the Pentateuch is is a completion of 4 originally independent documents. Now, I have tried to be careful in coloring what is a Yahwist and what is an Elohist and what is a Deuteronomist and what is a priestly. Priestly is very easy. It's always going to be black. Yahwist will always be blue. Elohist will be red. The green will be the Deuteronomist, but we do not encounter the Deuteronomist until we get to the book of Deuteronomy, which we are not covering in these lectures. Now, let's see if I can. The first of these, the Yahwist, or J. Now, Yahwist is spelled with a Y, but in German, they don't have a Y, they have a J. J was dated to sometime around Solomon. Some people think part of it was written even before David went to Jerusalem, but most of it might have been written about the time that Solomon died, which would put it around 950 BC, when this J source was written. Now, this is the J source, this is the Elohist source. This Elohist source was written approximately the time that the Jews were taken into captivity by the Assyrians, which would have made it around 750 BC, considerably after the time of the Yahwist source was written. A lot of times the Yahwist and the Elohist sources are combined into a JE source to give a story, even though we see different parts in the story. There are some things that are very characteristic, however, of both the Elohist and the Yahwist sources, and for that matter, the priestly source. The Yahwist source is always going to be concerned with things that took place in the south, in the place of Judah, in the southern part of the 12 tribes, the southern part south of the city of Jerusalem. The Elohist will always be to the north and deal with things that are in the northern tribe. The other difference is that the Yahwist source always uses Yahweh for God. The Elohist source uses Elohim for God. That was a way, if you could read the original Hebrew, it was easy to keep track of what was going on. One of the interesting ways of comparing these is the nature of the stories themselves. The Yahweh source has an anthropomorphic God. In other words, God behaves as if he were a human. As a matter of fact, there are instances where we think that maybe God was human or betraying a human in part of the time when God reveals himself. In the Elohist source, we get to some more esoteric material, and that's where you run into angels. The angels are always going to show up in the Elohist material. And the Yahweh source will never have angels. It always makes sure that it's got. If we get the priestly source, no, we don't get the priestly source. If we get to the priestly source is devoid of angels, is devoid of God as a human, is devoid of anything that might be of a human interest. As a matter of fact, one of the commentators I read seemed to indicate that the priestly source was put together in such a way as not to be tainted in any way by stories that might be interesting to people. The same commentator said, you'll find that the priestly source is complete and it has more material than the Yahwist and the Elohist sources. But it's hard to get through because it is dry as bones to read. The Elohist and the Yahwist sources are where we get the interesting stories. The priestly sources, no. But the priestly sources show up quite a bit. Now, let's go to chapter 28. Chapter 28 is when we have this story of Jacob when he first comes into Bethel, when he's still a man that's 25 years old, just fleeing from Esau. What am I doing? Okay. And he sees the angels going up and down the ladder. And there's no question this probably is an Elohist source. But if we go a little bit further, we find out that when we get to the second part of the chapter 35, then we find out that all of a sudden, oh boy, this is the Genesis 28, this is the Yahweh source. And what is the Yahweh source? It says, then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, surely the Lord is in this place. And he was afraid. And he answered, is this the place that none other than the house of God that is in the gate of heaven? So Jacob arose early in the morning and took the stone which he had put on his head, and he made it Bethel. The other story that we have, which is one of what we call a theophany. I looked up that word theophany in the dictionary today. I have to admit I'm using an old dictionary, one I got for Christmas in 1948. But it says a theophany is an appearance of God. And there are 3 cases where we have theophanies in the book of Genesis. And one of them is at the time when Jacob sees the angels in the ladders and sees God at the head of the staircase. The second one is the case where we have Jacob wrestling. Now, how many of you were brought up with the idea that Jacob wrestled with an angel? It does not say that in the book of Genesis. The only place that it says that Jacob wrestled with an angel is in the prophecy of Hosea. That's the only place. But the artists loved the idea of Jacob wrestling with an angel. But the book of Genesis says he wrestled with a man. And that man turned out, as the story goes, to be what? It turned out to be Joshua. It turned out to be Yahweh. This was very definitely written by the Yahwehs. Here is the Yahwehs of what we have in chapter 32. This is a story of Jacob wrestling with the Yahweh. The last bit is Elohist. You know why it's Elohist? That's quite interesting. Because this took place in Penuel, which is in Ephraim, which is in part of the north, and they wanted to make sure they got included too. And that's the only reason that it was put in that fashion. And then the last situation that we have is that that's the story. Chapter 35, what we just had gone through, is when Jacob again has a theophany with God. In this case, God is telling him again that your name will be what? Israel. What I have here are some pages. As soon as you got this memorized, I'll go to the next one. This is what I use. I got this as an appendix of one of the books that I have that gives me where all of these different parts of the Bible in the Torah, these different sources show up in the Torah. And I have tried to put some of these things together in this fashion so that we can read what is from the Yahwist and which is from the Elohist and which is from the priestly writers. This will become important when we get to chapter 37. Right now, I'd like to have you just remember, if you can, what we've said about the documentary source, or the documentary hypothesis, because it becomes very important a bit later on as well. Addendum means what? Add to the endum. Genesis 23, it says, Sarah died at Kiriath, and Abraham looked for a place to be buried. And among the places he looked, he came across this cave in Machpelah. Now, you can go read this in chapter 23. It's a very interesting story, how he felt that might be the proper place for Sarah to be buried. But it was in the region of Hebron where he was a sojourner. He was a visitor. He wanted to make sure that that cave would be his. And so he bargains, and I think I have this on the next there are a bunch of verses here that are in this chapter that I did not include, where he bargains to get that cave. They want to give it to him, but Abraham says, no, I don't want to have it given to me. I want to own it, because he felt very well that if they gave it to him, they could take it back as well. This way he had the ownership. And after this, Abraham buried Sarah, his wife, in the very cave of the field of Machpelah. And this cave that became the possible place for buried. Well, let me just say something else, Papa. Sarah was buried there. Later on, we're going to find out that there were other people that were buried there. I think I already mentioned the fact that Isaac was taken to the cave of Machpelah by Jacob and Esau. I think I also mentioned the fact that when Jacob died, he did not go to the cave or the place where Rachel was buried, but he went to the cave of Machpelah. We know that Sarah was buried at the cave of Machpelah. We don't know about Leah, but it's assumed that Leah was buried at the cave of Machpelah, as was Rebekah. So what we have is 3 couples that were buried at the cave of Machpelah. Now, it turns out there's an awful lot more to this cave of Machpelah than just this, and I'll see if we can get to some of it. The Zohar is a foundation work in the literature of Jewish mystical thought unknown as Kabbalah. I don't know what that means, but not considered to be scripture. It is a group of books including commentary on the mystical aspects of the Torah and scriptural interpretations, as well as material on mysticism, mythical cosmology, and mystical psychology. This is right straight out of the Wikipedia. Go and read in the Zohar. This is what you read. Machpelah means double in Hebrew. One reason given for that is that 4 prestigious couples are buried there. Well, I mentioned Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah, but guess who else is buried there? Adam and Eve are buried there, according to the Zohar, according to that interpretation. How did that come about? It came about in an interesting fashion, and that is that when Abraham was looking for a place to bury Sarah, he came across this cave and decided to examine the cave. As he got into the cave, and the further he got into the cave, the better it smelled, until he actually came to what looked like a gate and realized this was the gate to the Garden of Eden, and concluded that Adam and Eve, this is where Adam and Eve were buried. This is not in the Bible, by the way. This is in some of these mystical sayings. And that didn't make much difference as far as that cave is concerned. It was regarded by the Jews for a long time as being a very holy place, because Abraham and Isaac and Jacob were all buried there with their wives. And in the time of Christ, Herod the great builder, guess what? He built a temple above that cave. And that temple at the cave of Machpelah is shown in this slide. It was an awesome thing, to say the very least. It is one of the most holy places in Palestine right now, because supposedly you will find the caves of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but maybe Adam and Eve as well. This is a picture of what that building looks like now. This is a picture that was painted some years ago, around 1900. Here's another picture showing how large that building actually was. Well, that was built when? Around the time of Christ. Guess what? The building has a lot of interest in history. Around the 14th century, the Muslims rulers forbade the Jews from entering the site. When Islam came on the scene in 700 CE, 700 years after Christ, it wasn't long before the Muslims got control of that cave. The Muslims got control of that building, which they converted to a mosque. And we had the pictures of the mosque, and these are some pictures of the interior of the mosque. and a very beautiful place. And it is a very, very much honored place where people like to travel to. But unfortunately, it's not that easy to get to. And this little section that I have here, if you can read all the way through it, I try to highlight it. Highlight the point, the Cave of Machpelah is open to tourists and visitors this very day. But you have to go through a sector that is being occupied by the Muslims. And if you go to the town and you go by bus to the cave, that's fine. But if you walk, it says you better take an armed guard along with you because it would be dangerous. So that even to this day, the Cave of Machpelah is regarded as a very important place, not only to the Jews, but certainly to the Muslims and to the Christians as well. So like I said, there turned out to be an awful lot more in this chapter 35 than I had anticipated with the teraphim. I like to mention, I think I did mention the teraphim show up 9 different times in the Old Testament. The idea of graven images and gods and all that which are Canaanite gods, that shows up many more times. But there are some definite indications that there were things called the teraphim that were related to some ancient rituals that belonged to the Hebrews, associated with some sort of god that they might have worshipped long before they met Yahweh. Next week, we're going to go to chapter 37. 37 will take us all the way back to, guess what? All the way back to Shechem, to the time when Joseph was 18 years old. Because when Joseph was 18 years old, they were still living in Shechem, and that was the time that Joseph was kidnapped by his brothers and sold into slavery. Next week, we're going to talk about chapter 37 and look at it from the standpoint of the significance it played in developing the documentary hypothesis. I'll give you a little hint right now. You're going to find out that Joseph was kidnapped when he was in the region of Hebron or Shechem. Well, I don't know. Anyway, his brother Reuben tried to help him, but when Judah came to help him, he wasn't there. And then the Ishmaelites bought him, and the Midianites took him to Egypt. They're all the same story, but with different people. Next week, we're going to look at that story rather carefully and take a look at how we can look at what was written in the book of Genesis in chapter 37 and figure out who it was that might have written these particular parts. The end.